I went hiking alone in Oregon in late September. I had been planning it for months. I wanted a real break from people, from the usual noise, and from life, really. No phone, no emails, no schedules. Just trees, dirt, and long days walking through open land. I picked a loop trail deep in one of the more remote forest areas. It wasn't popular, and that was the point. It had been a while since I did anything solo that far out, but I felt ready. I packed my gear, double-checked everything, and left early on a Tuesday morning. The trail started out smooth. I parked at a gravel pull-off on the side of a forest road and started into the woods with a full pack. My plan was to hike for 3 or 4 days, moving slow and camping off the trail. I wasn't in a rush. I'd marked an old ranger's cabin on my map that I read about online. It was off the main loop, about 12 miles in, and I figured it'd make a good overnight spot. Some people said it was run down but dry. No one had posted about it in a while, so I wasn't expecting much. The first day was peaceful. The trail was quiet, covered in pine needles and fallen leaves. I didn't see anyone. It was cool, with a bit of breeze, but the sun kept things warm enough. I made about 10 miles that first day and set up my tent in a low clearing near a creek. Cooked a little dehydrated meal, rolled out my sleeping bag, and fell asleep to the sound of moving water. The second day, I veered off the main loop and went toward the old ranger's cabin. The trail thinned out a bit, and the forest got denser. Branches closed in overhead and the light dimmed. It had rained a few days before, so the ground was soft in places and muddy in others. The going was slow. I had to check my map often to stay on the right path. I reached the cabin in the late afternoon. It sat on a small rise, surrounded by tall trees and a thin clearing. It looked old, gray wood, sagging roof, one window, and a door with no lock. The cabin leaned slightly to one side, but it was still standing. The steps creaked when I walked up them. Inside, it was simple. One room, a cot frame without a mattress, a few broken shelves, an old, rusted stove. No signs of animals or people. It was dry, at least. The floor had dust, scattered leaves, a few dark patches from leaks in the roof, but it was better than setting up a tent in the cold. I unpacked just what I needed: sleeping pad, bag, some snacks, and water. There was no electricity, of course, just my headlamp and a small lantern. I didn't bother with a fire. There wasn't a fire ring, and the trees were close. It didn't feel right to light one. I ate inside, sitting on the cot frame, listening to the quiet. At some point, I turned off the light and laid down. That's when things started to feel off. It was just after dark when I heard the first sound, a crack of a branch, then another. I sat up, heart already moving faster. It's not unusual to hear wildlife outside, especially in Oregon forests. Deer, raccoons, even bears. I told myself it was probably a deer, but then I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, not quick or light. Slow, deliberate steps, heavy enough to crunch through the leaves and twigs. They weren't approaching fast, just steady. One step, then another. They were circling. I stayed completely still. My breathing got shallow. I turned off my headlamp and let my eyes adjust. The footsteps made a full circle around the cabin. Then they stopped. For a while, everything was silent, dead quiet. No wind, no animals, nothing. Then I heard the soft creak of a floorboard outside the door, like someone had stepped on the wooden porch. My chest tightened. I knew the door didn't lock. It had a handle, and that was it. I got up slowly, reached for my bag, and dragged it across the floor to brace the door. I found a small table and shoved that in front of it too. Then a chair. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I stood there in the dark, listening. The footsteps didn't come again for a long time, but after a while I heard scratching. Not loud, just a faint scraping sound near the door. Maybe fingers, maybe a knife. I didn't know. It lasted a few seconds, then silence again. I stayed up the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. I leaned against the far wall, facing the door, my headlamp in one hand and my pocket knife in the other. I kept listening. Every so often, I thought I heard something outside. A small snap, a shift of weight, but it was hard to tell. The cabin walls were thin, but sound plays tricks in the woods. When the sky began to lighten, I moved to the door. I waited until it was bright enough outside to see clearly, then pulled everything away and opened it. The ground outside was covered in soft mud and fallen leaves. It didn't take long to spot them, boot prints. A single set, wide and deep, made by someone big. The treads were worn and uneven, maybe old hiking boots. They circled the entire cabin, walked right up to the door, stood there, and on the door itself, long, shallow scratches. 5 of them, not claw marks, human length, not deep enough to dig in, but deep enough to be deliberate, like someone had run their fingers or a tool over it. They weren't random. I followed the prints for a bit. They led away into the woods on the opposite side from where I came in. They didn't run, just walked away. After maybe 30 yards, they faded into harder ground and disappeared. There were no signs of a campsite, no pack, no trash, no smoke or burned wood. Whoever it was didn't sleep nearby. Either they came from far off or they'd been watching for longer than I knew. Either way, they didn't want to be seen. And they didn't knock or call out. They just walked circles and scratched the door. I packed fast. I didn't eat. I didn't even refill my water bottle. I just got my things together and started back the way I came. I moved faster than I should have, took fewer breaks. My legs burned by the afternoon, and I kept checking behind me. I couldn't hear anything, but I didn't trust the silence anymore. Every noise put me on edge. I didn't sleep that night. I found a small clearing just off the trail, set up my tent, and sat inside with my knife in hand, listening. Nothing came, no steps, no voices, but I didn't feel alone. By the time I reached my car the next morning, I was exhausted. I tossed my gear into the trunk, locked the doors, and just sat there, trying to settle down. I drove until I hit cell service, then stopped at the first gas station I could find. I bought a coffee, stood in the bathroom with the lights on, and stared at myself in the mirror. I looked like hell, pale, tired, wired, but alive. I didn't tell anyone right away. What would I even say? Someone walked around a cabin and scratched the door? It sounds harmless when you say it like that. But when you're alone, miles from anyone, and there's no lock on the door, it doesn't feel harmless. Feels like a warning, like whoever was out there wanted to see how I'd react. I haven't gone solo since. I still hike, but never alone, and never without a lock, even on my tent zippers. I don't stay in abandoned buildings. I don't ignore sounds in the dark. I listen to my gut now, and I keep a light on longer than I need to. I don't know who that person was. Maybe someone living out there. Maybe just someone who gets a kick out of scaring people. But they were real. They were close, and they waited until I was asleep to come near. The woods aren't haunted, but they aren't empty either. And sometimes it's not the animals you need to worry about. It's the people watching from just beyond the trees. Quiet, patient, and waiting for you to let your guard down. I didn't that night, and I'm still here because of it. I had been staying in a small rental cabin in northern Vermont. I found it through a private listing on an old travel forum, not even through one of the big booking sites. The pictures showed a weathered little structure, single floor, tucked between trees with a view of a small lake. The price was cheap, which I liked, and it was remote, which I liked even more. I was between jobs, going through some things, and I just needed quiet. No cell signal, no internet, just a place to think. The drive up was long and mostly empty. Miles of cracked 2-lane roads cutting through patches of dense trees. Gas stations got fewer and more spread out the farther I went. Eventually, I turned off onto a gravel road that twisted uphill for nearly 10 miles. The cabin sat off a fork that barely looked like a road at all, more like a walking trail someone had driven on once or twice. The trees pressed in tight, branches hanging low enough to brush the roof of my car as I passed through. The cabin itself was older than the photos let on, but solid. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom with weak plumbing, and a wood stove in the corner of the living area. The back porch looked out over the lake, which was about 100 yards through the trees. There were no other houses in sight, just woods in every direction. No trail markings, no neighbors, no sounds except birds and wind. At night, it got quiet, dead quiet. No cars, no bugs, no distant hum of power lines or street lights, just the creaking of the place and the occasional snap of a twig outside. The first few days were uneventful. I brought books, a stack of old notebooks to write in, some canned food, and 2 cases of bottled water. There was a battery-powered radio, though I barely used it. I hiked a little during the day, stuck close to the cabin, and sat out on the back porch in the evenings, watching the sky turn dark. The nights started to feel heavy. There's something about that much silence that presses in on you after a while. The kind of silence where every sound you do hear gets under your skin a little. I kept waking up at night to noises I couldn't place. Soft thuds, a long scrape on the side of the cabin, a single tap against the glass. I tried not to overthink it. Old buildings make noise. Animals come close. Branches fall. That kind of thing. Still, by the end of the first week, I started double-checking the locks before bed. I moved the bed away from the window and shut all the curtains tight. Then I found the phone. It was maybe 10 days in. I was walking the edge of the woods near the front of the cabin, thinking about whether to head down to the lake or start a fire early. There was this patch of ground where the pine needles had been disturbed. It wasn't anything dramatic. No huge footprints or broken branches. Just a slight depression in the earth and some marks that looked like someone had stepped there recently. Near the base of a tree, half buried under old leaves, I saw a black rectangle. It was a phone. Screen down, no case, scuffed along one side. It hadn't been there long, maybe a day or 2 at most. I picked it up. It was cold and dirty, and the screen was cracked in one corner. There was no SIM card. The phone was an older Android model, scratched but not broken. When I held the power button, it buzzed once and turned on. The lock screen came up with no pin, just a swipe to open. The battery was at 22%. At first, there wasn't much. The home screen was empty except for the default apps. No contacts, no text history, no browser bookmarks. It felt like someone had wiped it clean, almost. But when I opened the photo gallery, I found dozens of pictures. The thumbnails were all dark and blurry. I started going through them one by one. Every photo had been taken at night. Most were black shapes, out of focus or partially blocked by trees. But I started recognizing pieces of the cabin. The corner of the porch, the frame of a window, the back door, a shot through the trees showing the outline of the building at a distance. The deeper I scrolled, the closer the photos got. There were ones taken right up against the glass of the windows. Pictures of the living room, my backpack by the wood stove, the chair I sat in. One shot was pointed through the bedroom window. It was angled so you could see the bed. The sheets were messed up the same way I left them each morning. Some photos had timestamps. They were taken over several nights, starting about 3 days before I found the phone, usually between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. I checked the camera roll info. Every photo had GPS turned off. The phone had no signal, no Wi-Fi history, no saved locations. I checked every folder I could. There were no videos, no messages, no emails. Just those photos. My skin was cold. I sat there holding the phone, scrolling back and forth. I opened the door and walked the perimeter of the cabin, heart pounding. The air was still. I looked for footprints, signs of movement, anything out of place. But the forest floor covered everything fast. I couldn't tell what was old and what was new. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair with the stove cold, lights off, waiting. I kept listening for sounds, thinking I'd hear someone come back. But there was nothing. The next morning, I hiked a mile up the trail to where I had a single bar of reception. I called the sheriff's office in the nearest town. They said they'd send someone out the following afternoon to pick up the phone. I asked if they had any open cases of break-ins or missing persons nearby. The man on the phone said no. Not up in that area, he said. Too far off for most folks. I thought about packing up and driving out, but part of me didn't want to leave without knowing more. I wasn't scared exactly, not yet, just uneasy. I started watching the woods more. I dragged a heavy chair in front of the bedroom window at night and put a pot on top of it, hoping it would fall if someone tried to look in again. That afternoon, I stayed near the front of the cabin waiting for the deputy. Nobody showed. No call. I hiked back to the ridge the next morning and tried again. No answer this time. I left a message. The phone was still on, battery slowly draining. I left it charging by the kitchen window. At some point, the gallery updated. I didn't know if the phone had synced to something, but a new photo had appeared. One I hadn't seen before. It was taken the night before. A shot through the front window looking into the cabin. You could see me barely sitting in the chair by the stove. The photo was slightly blurred, but it was clear enough to see my outline, my legs stretched out, the cup next to me on the floor. I hadn't gone outside. That meant someone was standing just feet from the glass, taking pictures. I checked the door locks again. Every one of them. I pulled the blinds tight, stuffed towels in the window cracks. I stayed up all night again, barely blinking, ears straining. But whoever it was didn't come back. Or if they did, they didn't take more pictures. The deputy arrived the next afternoon. He pulled up in a county truck, a big man with pale skin and a thick mustache. I told him what happened and showed him the phone. He didn't seem surprised. Not exactly, more like resigned. He took the phone, scrolled through the photos, then asked a few questions. Had I seen anyone? Any strange vehicles? Did I touch the lens of the phone or clean it off? I told him no, just picked it up where I found it. He said they'd look into it and that I could file a formal report at the station if I wanted. I asked if there'd been other reports like this. He shrugged and said, "Stuff happens up here sometimes. Usually some local kid messing around, but we'll check it out." That night I didn't sleep either. I decided I'd had enough. I packed the car in the morning and left. The drive back felt longer, more tense. Every pull-off looked like a place someone could be hiding. Every car I passed made me uneasy. A week after I got home, I followed up with the sheriff's office. They said they still hadn't identified the owner of the phone. No prints, no matches in their system. No one had come forward to claim it. They said the most likely explanation was a trespasser. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone squatting in the woods who got curious about the cabin. They hadn't found any camps or other signs nearby, just the phone. I thought that was the end of it. But a few months later, I was going through some old photos I'd taken with my own camera while I was out there. Shots of the lake, the trees, the cabin at sunset. In one of them, taken from the porch facing the woods, I saw a shape I hadn't noticed before. It was far back, just between the trees. Blurry, out of focus, but it looked like a person, standing completely still, looking at the cabin. I zoomed in as far as I could. There wasn't much detail, just a tall, pale figure, face indistinct, body slightly turned like they were hiding behind a tree. I don't know how long they were standing there. I don't know if they were watching me the whole time or just happened to be there when I took the picture. But now when I think back, I wonder how many nights they were out there. How long they had been watching. How many times they had gotten close enough to touch the windows. How many times I almost caught them. And worst of all, I keep thinking about the fact that I found the phone. Like they wanted me to. Like they left it for me to see. And maybe, just maybe, they're not done yet. I still think about that trip to the Ozarks more than I care to admit. I've run through every moment in my head 100 times, trying to figure out if there was something I missed. Some early signs, some red flag, but it always plays out the same. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend in the woods. Just me, my wife, and our 2 kids, tucked away in a family cabin that hadn't been used in over a year. Peaceful break. Instead, we left with the sense that someone had been watching us the entire time, and that they didn't want us to leave. The cabin itself wasn't anything special. A 1-story wooden structure that my dad and uncle built back in the 80s. It sat on a few acres of sloping land surrounded by dense trees and brush, a good 15 miles from the nearest town. No real neighbors, just a few other cabins scattered miles apart, most of them empty except during deer season. The road leading up to it was gravel and rough in some spots, but our truck handled it just fine. We arrived late in the afternoon on a Friday. My wife, Amy, rode shotgun while our kids, Nate and Lucy, were passed out in the back. The sun was getting low by the time we pulled into the clearing where the cabin sat. Everything looked untouched. The pine needles had piled up on the roof and deck, and there were no tire tracks or footprints that I could see. just the way we left it. That was comforting at first. I backed the truck up beside the cabin, close to the deck, and we unloaded our stuff. Just a few duffels, some groceries, sleeping bags for the kids. Amy wiped down the counters while I opened the windows to air the place out. It smelled like stale wood and dry leaves. No surprise. It was peaceful though, with that kind of quiet you only get deep in the woods. No road noise, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds. We cooked a simple dinner that night, hot dogs and beans on the old propane stove. Afterward, the kids explored the woods near the cabin while I chopped some firewood. We made a fire in the stone ring out back and roasted marshmallows, then put the kids to bed and had a drink by the fire until the cold chased us inside. I didn't sleep well that night, not because of anything specific, just the usual creaks and groans of an old cabin settling in the cold. The wind kicked up now and then, making the trees knock together. Once or twice I thought I heard something outside, but it could have been a raccoon or deer. The next morning, I woke up early and went outside to start coffee on the propane burner we kept out on the deck. That's when I noticed something odd. Nothing huge, just strange. There were no birds, no squirrels, nothing moving. The woods were still in a way that didn't feel right. I shook it off and figured it was just early or maybe the cold had everything hunkered down. We spent that day walking the trails behind the cabin, fishing at the creek a mile down the hill, just enjoying the quiet. It was supposed to be a relaxing time, and for a while it was. The kids were happy, Amy was relaxed, and I even managed to nap in the hammock for a bit. It wasn't until late afternoon that I noticed something that made my stomach turn. I was walking around the truck, getting ready to load up some trash to take back into town the next day, when I glanced down and saw something in the front driver's side tire. At first I thought it was a rock jammed into the tread, but when I crouched down and looked closer, I realized it was a screw. A long one, silver, with the head sticking out just a bit. I pulled it out slowly. It was at least 3 inches long and had been driven in straight, not at an angle like you'd expect from running something over. My first thought was bad luck. Maybe it was in the driveway or picked up on the way in. But when I checked the other 3 tires, I found one in each of them. Each one screwed in perfectly, like someone had taken their time with a drill. The same kind of screw in all of them, long, shiny, and clearly not something that had been stepped on by accident. My mouth went dry. I called Amy out, showed her, and we just stood there, looking at the truck like it had turned into something dangerous. We didn't say anything right away. The implications were obvious. Someone had done this deliberately. All 4 tires were compromised. Whoever did it hadn't just wanted to make a point. They wanted to make sure we couldn't leave. I checked the pressure. Amazingly, they were all still holding air. The screws must have sealed the holes for the time being, but driving on them would push the air out fast. If we tried to leave without fixing it, we'd be stranded within a few miles. And the nearest rail help was back in town, 15 miles of rough road away. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going until well past midnight and sat on the deck with the axe and my flashlight, listening. The woods were still dead quiet. No wind, no animal noises. Felt like the trees themselves were waiting for something. I kept imagining someone in those woods, just past where the firelight stopped, watching, listening. I scanned the tree line every few minutes, but never saw anything. In the morning, we tried to keep calm for the kids' sake. We told them we'd had a small issue with the truck and needed to stick around another day to get it fixed. Amy took them down to the creek to play while I looked over the truck again. I pulled the screws out one by one, then plugged the holes as best I could with a patch kit I kept in the emergency box. I only had 1 can of Fix-A-Flat, so I used it on the worst tire. It might hold long enough to get us down the road, but I didn't trust it. Around noon, I heard the kids yelling from down the trail. Not scared, just excited. They'd found something. When they came back, Nate was holding a piece of fabric, torn and dirty. It looked like part of a jacket, the kind with synthetic stuffing inside. He said they found it caught on a branch near the creek. I took it from him and looked it over. It was damp and smelled like mildew, but something about it felt wrong. It looked fresh, too fresh to have been out there for long. I told Amy we needed to leave that afternoon, truck or no truck. I didn't care if we had to crawl on the rims to get to the highway. I finished patching the tires, checked the pressure again, and packed everything back into the truck. Before we loaded up the kids, I walked the perimeter of the cabin one last time, looking for anything. Footprints, broken branches, signs of someone being nearby. I found something near the back edge of the clearing. A small pile of cigarette butts and an old can of baked beans. Someone had been camping there recently. Maybe just a hunter, maybe not. The butts were fresh. The ground was disturbed. Whoever it was, they'd been close, watching, maybe even staying there while we were inside. We piled into the truck and started down the road. I took it slow, heart pounding the whole time. Every bump and pothole felt like it could be the one that blew the patch job wide open. But mile after mile, the tires held. I didn't breathe easy until we were well past the tree-line and could see the first real signs of town up ahead. We went straight to the gas station on the edge of town and I checked the tires again. 2 were almost flat. 1 was beyond saving. I asked the clerk if he had a compressor and he pointed me around back. While I worked, I asked if anyone had come through recently. Someone on foot maybe, or looking like they'd been camping. He shook his head, said not in a while. We didn't go back to the cabin after that. Not for a long time. I had the truck fully serviced, replaced all 4 tires, and filed a report with the sheriff, but nothing ever came of it. They said it was probably kids or someone messing around, but that didn't fit. The screws weren't random. They were carefully placed, evenly spaced, hidden just enough to go unnoticed for a while. It's been 2 years now. The cabin sits empty. I think about selling it, but part of me doesn't want to let it go. Not because of nostalgia, but because I want to keep an eye on it. Because I still don't know who did it or why. Because it felt like a warning. Someone wanted us stuck out there. Maybe to scare us. Maybe for something worse. And I still don't know how close we came to finding out. I hadn't been to the Upper Peninsula in a long time. The last time was years ago when I went ice fishing with my uncle near Marquette. I remembered the landscape being quiet, flat in some places, but then rugged and thick with trees in others. You could drive for an hour and not pass a single person. When my friend Connor invited me to a hunting cabin that belonged to one of his coworkers, I didn't hesitate. I needed the break. Life back home had gotten too loud, too cluttered. He said it was primitive, no electricity, no cell service, just a wood stove and a roof. That was exactly what I wanted. We got there late in the afternoon on a Friday. It was mid-October, and already the temperature was dropping fast at night. The air had that deep, woody smell of pine and cold water. The cabin sat back in a clearing about 3/4 of a mile off an old dirt logging road. We had to park at a turnoff and hike the rest of the way in. Connor had been there once before with the guy who owned it, so he was more familiar with the layout. I just followed, carrying a pack with food, clothes, and a sleeping bag. The place was small, maybe 15 by 20 feet. It was made from unpainted, rough-cut logs. A single window faced out toward the clearing. There was a small stone fire ring outside, a few stumps around it for sitting. The door was thick and heavy, with a steel latch and a padlock. Inside, it was just as simple. 2 bunks, a table, a few mismatched chairs, a shelf of canned food, and a wood stove with a steel chimney running out through the roof. There was no insulation, just walls and a roof. It would be enough. The first night passed quietly. We cooked hot dogs over the fire outside and watched the sky turn orange and then black. The stars were something else. No light pollution at all. The cold crept in fast once the sun dropped, and we took turns feeding the stove inside during the night to keep the chill off. I slept hard. The next morning, after coffee boiled over a propane camp stove, we decided to explore a little. The area around the cabin was all woods and brush. The trees were tall and spaced close, mostly pines with patches of birch and maple. The ground was uneven, scattered with boulders and long fallen trees that had softened into mossy humps. Connor had a hand-drawn map that showed some trails and deer stands placed throughout the land. The map was old and faded. His buddy had drawn it years ago when they first started hunting out there. We followed a trail that ran northeast of the cabin. It was more like a faint path, really barely visible in places. Leaves had fallen thick and it was easy to lose. We weren't tracking time, just wandering, taking in the place. About an hour in, we veered off the trail to loop back. That's when we found it. The tree stand was tucked high in a pine tree about 60 yards from the trail. There was no ladder, just old screw-in steps that spiraled up the trunk. It wasn't marked on the map. That caught my attention immediately. Connor hadn't remembered it being there before either. He pointed out that the stand looked newer than the rest we'd seen. Black metal, lightly weathered but not rusted. There was no nameplate or markings on it. What struck me most was how carefully it had been placed. It was positioned at just the right height between the upper limbs and aimed directly back at the direction we had come from. At first I thought nothing of it. Then I turned and looked through the gap in the trees, trying to line up where it was pointing. That's when I realized it was aimed directly at the cabin. We stood there for a long minute, just looking. From where the stand sat, through a clean line of trees, you could clearly see the roof of the cabin. Not just part of it, the entire front, including the only window. Someone had picked that spot intentionally. That much was clear. What made it worse was what we found next. Strapped to the railing of the stand was a set of binoculars. They were lashed with bungee cords and angled down at the exact line of sight toward the cabin. It was like someone had been watching. Not hunting, not even scouting, just observing. We didn't speak, just stood there and looked up at it. There was no trail to the stand. No sign of people walking in and out. The underbrush around the tree was untouched, like it had been placed there and never visited again, or visited very carefully. We both had that crawling feeling in our guts, the kind of feeling you don't shake easily. We backed out and returned to the cabin in silence. We didn't run, but we didn't take our time either. I remember the air feeling different when we got back. Still quiet, but heavier, like something was listening. I tried to brush it off. Told myself it could be an old stand that hadn't been marked, and maybe someone had left the binoculars years ago. Still, I didn't believe it. The metal was too clean. The straps on the binoculars weren't even sun-bleached. That night, we kept the lantern off inside the cabin and used headlamps instead. The single window didn't have a curtain, so we rigged up a towel to hang over it with some nails and string. We didn't talk much, just sat inside, occasionally getting up to toss wood into the stove. I tried reading, couldn't focus. Every sound outside felt closer than it should have been. There were no animals, no wind, just silence. Around midnight, I got up to use the bathroom, just stepping off the edge of the clearing into the trees. I carried a flashlight and kept it aimed low. As I walked out, something made me stop. It wasn't a noise, just a feeling. I turned the light toward the tree line across the clearing, the direction of the stand. There was nothing visible, just black trees, but I swear I felt someone watching. That tight feeling across your shoulders. I went quick, came back in fast, and locked the door behind me. Didn't say anything to Connor. He was lying on his bunk, eyes open, just staring at the ceiling. The next morning, we decided not to explore anymore. We weren't scared exactly, but something felt wrong. We cleaned up, repacked some of our gear, and talked about heading out early the next day. One more night. That was the plan. That afternoon, I took another look at the tree line with binoculars from the cabin. I swept slowly, starting at the ground and moving up, and then out toward the direction of the unknown stand. I thought maybe I'd see movement, a shape, but it was empty. I almost convinced myself we'd overthought it. But later, while cleaning up the brush behind the cabin, I found something worse. There were boot prints. They were faint, not fresh from that day, but they were clear, maybe a few days old. The ground was still soft from recent rain. You could see the tread, the heel marks. They weren't from us. We had different boots, different sizes, and they didn't come from the direction of the trail either. They came from deep woods, the same direction as the tree stand. Worse still, they circled the back of the cabin and stopped near the window, then disappeared back into the woods. I told Connor. We walked the perimeter and found more prints. Faint but definitely human. Not animal. Not bear or deer. Someone had been moving around near the cabin in the last few days. Probably while no one was supposed to be there. That changed things. We decided to leave the next morning at first light. There was nothing keeping us there, and neither of us wanted to sleep another night under those binoculars. We kept the fire low that night and made sure our gear was packed. Both of us slept with our boots on. I didn't sleep much, neither did he. We kept watch in shifts, more or less. Around 3 in the morning, I stepped outside to get more wood for the stove. I swept the flashlight across the clearing, and that's when I saw it. The glint, a reflection, for just a second, deep in the trees, directly in line with the stand. Could have been an animal's eye, could have been moisture, but it was right at the height where a face would be. I stared for a full minute and saw nothing else. I didn't go after it. I went back inside and didn't speak. First light, we left. Hiked fast, didn't look back. The air felt colder than it had all weekend. The trees felt closer, tighter. The silence was the same. When we got back to the car, we both looked around carefully. Tires were fine. No footprints. Nothing out of place. We didn't talk much on the way back downstate. A few days later, Connor called the guy who owned the cabin and asked if he knew about the stand. He didn't. Said there weren't supposed to be any other stands in that direction. Said the land hadn't been hunted in 2 years. He was quiet when Connor told him about the binoculars. That was the last time I went up there. I don't think about it much anymore, but sometimes, when I'm walking in the woods closer to home and things go quiet, that feeling creeps back in. Like someone standing just behind the trees, watching. Not hunting, not lost, just watching. I'd hunted in the same region of central Idaho for years. It was a quiet place, hard country to get into and harder to stay in. I'd been going there since the late 90s, mostly in the fall, when the elk were moving and the air had that cold, sharp smell. My old buddy Jeff used to go with me, but in 2005, he had just had his second kid and couldn't get away. So that year, I went alone. The cabin I used wasn't anything fancy. It was an old one-room set up with a small wood stove, a bunk, a table, and a door that only locked from the inside with a thick wooden bar I rigged myself. No electricity, no running water. Just enough roof to keep the weather off. It was miles from the nearest real road and even farther from anyone who didn't want to be left alone. That year I arrived in late October. The weather was colder than usual, and there was already a layer of snow on the ground. It was just me, my pack, a .30-06 bolt-action rifle, a sidearm, and enough food and gear to last a week. I parked my truck about a mile down the trailhead. There's no point in trying to drive the logging roads all the way in unless you want to snap an axle, and hauled my gear the rest of the way. The first few days were the usual routine. Get up early, hike to a ridge or a clearing, glass for movement, follow game trails. I had seen some elk sign, but nothing close. No shots fired. I'd come back to the cabin around dusk, light a fire, heat some can stew, maybe drink a bit of whiskey and read a book by lantern light. It was cold at night, down in the teens, but I had a good sleeping bag and heavy canvas to hang over the windows. There was something peaceful about it. Quiet, still. But by the 4th day, things started to feel a little off. It's hard to explain. It's not like I saw anything or heard anything specific, but I kept feeling like someone was nearby. I'd be walking through a thicket or crossing a creek bed and get this pressure on the back of my neck. Like eyes. I started checking over my shoulder more. I walked slower. I listened harder. I thought maybe it was just because I was alone. Being alone in the woods can mess with your mind, especially if you're used to having a buddy nearby. That night, I triple-checked the latch on the door before I went to sleep. I didn't hear anything strange. No footsteps, no branches breaking, no distant sounds of engines or voices. But I didn't sleep well either. I kept waking up in the dark and staring at the shadows on the ceiling, listening to the wind push against the logs. The next day, I went a little farther out than usual, hoping to track a herd I'd seen a few miles northeast. I left the cabin early and packed some extra food and my sidearm, just in case. I didn't make it more than half a mile when I saw something strange. A shape in the snow just ahead on the trail. It was a boot print. That wouldn't be strange by itself. There are hunters in the area every year. But it wasn't mine and it wasn't old. It was sharp, defined, and clear, left just that morning, maybe even within the hour. And it was headed toward my cabin, not away from it. I just stood there for a few seconds, staring down at it. Then I followed it a little farther. There were more prints, and they were spaced out in a way that showed whoever it was had been walking steady. Not running, not limping, just walking. I looked around but didn't see anyone. The trees were thick enough that you couldn't see more than 50 feet in some directions. I started to feel exposed, like I was out in the open and someone was tucked in the trees watching me. I turned around and went back to the cabin. Slowly, I stopped often, checking behind me, scanning the woods. The snow muffled everything. My own footsteps were soft. The wind moved the trees just enough to create little creaks and snaps, like someone stepping on twigs far away. When I got back to the cabin, everything looked normal. The door was closed, the window covers were still in place, and there was no sign of a break-in. But I still walked a full circle around it. I found another set of prints, these ones coming from the opposite direction I had taken, and they led right up to the window on the north side. Whoever had made them had stood there for a while. The snow was flattened out in a wide oval, and you could see the marks of someone shifting their weight. I went inside and barred the door. I didn't unpack. I didn't take off my coat. I sat in the chair by the door with my rifle across my lap and waited for the sun to start going down. I didn't light the lantern that night. I just kept the fire low and stayed in the shadows. I barely slept. Every sound outside made me grip the rifle tighter. The next morning, I knew I had to leave, but I wasn't going to do it in a panic. I ate a cold breakfast, packed up slowly, and got everything ready. But when I opened the door, I saw something new. A bolt, not a regular arrow, a crossbow bolt. It was stuck in the wood of the cabin door, just a few inches to the right of where the latch was. It hadn't been there the night before. The feathers on the tail were bright red, and the shaft was black carbon. It was buried in deep. My hands started shaking a little, and not from the cold. I backed into the cabin and closed the door. I rebarred it, put my back to it, and stood there thinking. Whoever it was, they had been within a few feet of me during the night. They had a crossbow, and they knew exactly where the cabin was. They had walked right up and fired that bolt into the door. It wasn't random. It wasn't a warning shot either. If I had stepped outside even a few minutes earlier, I could have been hit. I moved fast after that. I dragged the table and the bunk in front of the door. Then I took every bit of furniture and gear I had and built a barricade in the bathroom, the only room in the cabin that had no windows and a solid door. I took the rifle, sidearm, and all the ammo into the bathroom with me, along with food, water, and my pack. I closed the door and sat down with my back against it. I stayed there all day. The sun came through a crack in the wall, and I watched it move across the floor until it was gone. I didn't hear anything until after dark. That's when the footsteps came. Slow, crunching in the snow. They moved around the cabin. Not fast, not loud, just deliberate. I held the rifle tight and kept the barrel pointed at the floor. I didn't want to give away my position with noise. Then there was silence. It was hours before I moved. I finally leaned forward and braced myself against the floor, listening for any sign that they were still out there. But nothing came. No more footsteps. No sounds of a vehicle. No light. Eventually I dozed off, still in the corner of the bathroom with my rifle across my chest. When I woke up again, it was just starting to get light out. I waited until the full sun was up before I came out. The cabin was freezing. The fire was long out. I crept out of the bathroom and scanned the main room. Nothing had moved. No one had tried to come inside. The bolt was still in the door. I pulled it out slowly, then packed up and left. I didn't take the trail. I cut east through the trees, moving fast, taking the long way around. I kept the rifle in my hands the whole time, and I didn't stop until I could see the edge of the road where I'd left the truck. The windows were still intact. Nothing slashed. I got in, started the engine, and drove the hell out of there. I filed a report with the local sheriff when I got into town. Gave them everything I remembered, the prints, the bolt, the feeling of being watched, the sound of footsteps. They took it seriously at first. A deputy even went out to check the cabin a couple days later. But he didn't find much. By then, the snow had covered the tracks, and no bolt was left behind. He said there were no signs of break-in or forced entry. The official report said they didn't have enough evidence to open a real investigation. I never heard anything more about it. They never found who it was. No prints, no suspects, no motive. Nothing. After that, I never went back to that cabin again. I sold off the hunting lease that spring and started going to places with more people around. Lodges, public lands, anywhere that didn't leave me completely isolated. To this day, I don't know who it was or why they were out there, but I know what I saw. I know how quiet the woods can get when someone's watching you. I know what it feels like to be hunted. And I know that whoever was out there with that crossbow wasn't lost, wasn't just passing through, and wasn't planning to miss. I was living in a small city in Oregon when I decided I needed a break from everything. The city wasn't loud or chaotic, but I'd gotten into a routine that was slowly grinding me down. My job in IT was remote, which meant I could technically live anywhere. I started looking for short-term rentals outside the city. Nothing fancy. I wasn't trying to do some luxury retreat. I just wanted quiet and space to breathe. I found a listing for a cheap off-grid cabin about 3 hours north, right near the border between Oregon and Washington, tucked in the thick forest of the Pacific Northwest. It had a small wood stove, solar panels for minimal power, a water tank with a gravity filter, and supposedly decent cell reception if I needed it. The photos showed an old structure, with siding faded to gray, a narrow front porch, a small clearing around it before the forest swallowed everything. No neighbors, no noise, just what I wanted. The listing said it was rugged and best suited for a self-sufficient renter. I booked it for 6 weeks. I drove up in my old SUV with enough supplies to last the first 2 weeks. Canned food, dry goods, drinking water, fuel for the camp stove, and some tools. I packed my shotgun too, more out of habit than any real concern. The drive-in got rough after the last 30 miles. The paved road ended and the gravel washboard surface began. My GPS got confused more than once, and I had to double-check landmarks based on the listing directions. I finally found the place around noon. The cabin looked just like it had in the pictures, maybe more weathered. The clearing was only about 50 feet wide in all directions, thick fir trees closing in tight behind it. The trees grew tall and close together, and even during the day, it felt dim in the shade they cast. The air smelled of moss and wet bark. Inside, the place was small but functional. One main room with a small table, a twin bed, shelves, and the wood stove. There was a door to a bathroom with a composting toilet and a gravity-fed shower, the kind you fill with a few gallons and let trickle out over your head. No luxuries. It was clean enough, dusty but not gross. I opened the windows and let in the breeze while I unpacked. The first few days were quiet. I worked a little in the mornings, checked emails, and ran a few diagnostics for my job using the weak LTE signal I could pick up by standing near the window. In the afternoons, I chopped wood, went for short hikes, or just sat outside and listened. The silence was what hit me most. No hum of cars, no voices, not even planes overhead. Just wind in trees, birds, the occasional squirrel or woodpecker. By the end of the first week, I noticed the smell. It wasn't strong at first, just something faint in the background, like rotting leaves or wet dog. I thought maybe a dead animal had crawled under the porch or something. The smell came and went depending on the wind. I made a mental note to check under the building if it got worse. But it didn't just get worse. It got sharper, more bitter. By day 10, the cabin smelled like spoiled meat every time I stepped inside. I searched the kitchen area, checked my trash, even cleaned out the composting toilet thinking maybe something had gotten stuck. Nothing. That's when I noticed the draft. There was a soft flow of cold air coming from under one of the bookshelves. It wasn't a built-in shelf. It looked like it had just been shoved up against the wall. I pulled it away, dust flying up into my face. Behind it, I found a narrow wooden panel with a small circular hole near the top, like a finger pull. I'd already been living there for over a week, and I had no idea there was a hidden door. I knelt down and pulled. The panel creaked, stuck, then popped loose, revealing a black rectangle of space. A crawl space. The smell hit me hard, much stronger now, like old sweat, urine, and meat left too long in the sun. I hesitated. I wasn't eager to crawl into some dark pit under the floor, but I also needed to know what the hell was going on. I got my flashlight and my gloves. The opening was tight, maybe 3 feet high, I had to lie flat and slide on my stomach. The ground was packed dirt, uneven and cold. My light caught movement at first, my own shadow playing on the walls. Then it settled, and I saw what was there. Sleeping bags. 3 of them, unrolled and bunched up like nests. Food wrappers, old granola bar packs, instant noodle cups, empty water bottles. Used syringes, a dozen or more, scattered across the dirt. The smell was strongest back there, where a bucket half filled with some dark liquid sat in the corner. Someone had been living under my floor. I backed out slowly, heart hammering. It wasn't the fear of ghosts or anything like that. It was the pure, dry fear of knowing a real human had been down there, hiding under me, sleeping while I slept, listening to every move I made. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on, what little power I had, and stayed up in a chair with my shotgun across my lap. I thought about driving out that night, but the road was narrow and rough, and I didn't like the idea of driving sleepy and panicked. I waited until morning. By daylight, everything felt a little more manageable. I packed my stuff fast, only the essentials. I was ready to go by 9 a.m., but something made me stop before locking up. I needed to check it again. Maybe I thought I imagined it. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself I wasn't overreacting. I opened the panel again and shined my light in. This time I didn't crawl in. I just aimed the beam. 2 of the sleeping bags were gone. Just gone. I stood frozen. Nothing else looked touched. The trash was still there. The bucket. The wrappers. But 2 of the nests were gone, like someone had cleaned up in the night. I left immediately. I drove until I hit cell service, then called the local sheriff's office. I gave them the location and told them what I found. They took my info and said they'd send someone out. A deputy called me the next day, said they checked it out. The crawl space was empty by then. No sleeping bags, no syringes, nothing. He said it looked like someone had been squatting there, but they were long gone. He told me it happens more than people realize. Off-grid places get found, used by addicts or drifters. Said it was good I left. I didn't go back. I left the rest of my gear in the cabin and told the owner I wouldn't be finishing the rental. For weeks after, I kept waking up at night imagining footsteps above me, the sound of breath just under the floor. I thought about how long they had been there, days, weeks. Had they watched me through cracks in the floorboards? Had they come up when I left for hikes? Used my things, eaten my food, stood over me while I slept? What scared me most wasn't what I saw. It was what I didn't see. They knew I found their hiding place, and they left in the night, quiet, invisible, like they'd done it before. Whoever they were, they knew the woods better than me, knew how to vanish, knew how to wait. I've never stayed alone off-grid again. Not because I'm afraid of the forest. I'm afraid of who else might be out there. Not animals, not ghosts, people. The kind that know how to crawl under your life and wait.